most perhaps, certainly many well-born young Englishmen, British men, and some women, a smaller number, but some, when they were young adults, would undertake the European Grand Tour. That usually meant Italy as the main destination. It was meant to be a classical education for the young men in question, to see the sites of the great Renaissance and classical civilizations which had done so much to produce the intellectual life of Western Europe. Some young men took the Grand Tour seriously and studied art and sculpture and looked at the sites where the classical poets lived and that sort of thing. But Boswell turned his tour of Europe into a highly unorthodox version of the Grand Tour. First of all, he got into the company of a venerable old Scotsman and a former Jacobite, George Keith, the Lord Marischal. And he traveled with him through the German courts, met many of the princes of those courts in Brunswick and Potsdam. He got glimpses of Frederick the Great of Prussia. Then he parted from Frederick and decided that what he really wanted to do was meet some of the most glorious literary and philosophical eminences of the time. Boswell, even as a young man, was far less interested in landscape, painting, sculpture, although he diligently tried to take notes on the paintings and sculpture that he saw. He was far more fascinated by authors, writers, and people of eminence, stability, and accomplishment. It's what he longed to become himself. So he took himself to visit Voltaire in Ferney, and he took himself to meet Rousseau, at that time exiled in the Swiss village of Moutier. He spoke to these people and recorded his conversations with them in his diaries. That's why they're such valuable documents for us now. After he met Rousseau, he was inspired with a very unusual and strange idea, and that was to go and visit the very little visited and dangerous island of Corsica. The main purpose of Boswell's quest was not so much the island, but the illustrious leader of the insurgents, Pasquale Paoli. And Boswell came to Corsica, traveled to Corte, found that Paoli wasn't there, that he had moved off to the little village of Solicaro. Boswell got himself all the way there and managed to secure interviews with Paoli, wrote down what he said in his diaries. And at some point after his return, or during his return to Scotland, we don't know the exact point, he decided he would turn this aventure into a book, which he duly did, an account of Corsica and memoirs of Pasquale Paoli, which was published in 1768 and became a runaway bestseller and brought great fame in Europe, both to General Paoli and to the young author himself. It was translated into several European languages, came out in a second and then a third edition within a year of its publication, and established Boswell's reputation as Corsica Boswell. What Boswell brought to a British readership in the figure of Paoli was a form of enlightened political leadership. What Paoli had done in the very short period of his administration was remarkable, even now, when you just list them: a press, a university, a navy, a mint, a version of universal suffrage, not entirely universal, but certainly a more modern form of voting than other places had had. And above all, a version of a democratic constitution in which the people declared a self-sovereignty, not answerable to any higher authority than themselves, and the separation of powers. As Britain thought of its own future and what relationship would exist between its own parliament and the monarchy, what sort of rule it would continue to have over its own colonies in America and elsewhere. As Britain was contemplating those things, here was a beam of very interesting light. Look at the way General Paoli had done things in Corsica. This is very well worth thinking about. That is very much part of the reason Pauli was received so well by all members of the political spectrum, across the whole spectrum, Whig, Tory. Boswell created a climate of admiring appreciation in Britain. Some of the admiration was for Boswell himself. It really was an intrepid thing that he did. It was quite dangerous. It took quite an act of courage to do what he did. It was a dangerous situation. Even the sea crossing from Livonia was dangerous. Boswell feared corsairs, that he might be taken and enslaved. Such things did happen. It was physically arduous. He caught malaria from having been bitten by mosquitoes on the sea crossing. He borrowed somebody's boots to walk around Corsica and they were too tight, and he developed painful ingrowing toenails. So people admired Boswell himself as an adventurer who went off to a dangerous place and came back to tell the rest of the world, not brave enough to go there, what it was like. Travelers' narratives were quite popular at the time. Reports were coming in from the South Seas. What were the new areas of Pacific Ocean exploration were making news back in Britain and Western Europe. The people of those countries were beginning to wonder what other systems were like and how can we think about them? How do they relate to us? And Boswell fed directly into that pool of interest.